Thank you so much for joining us today for our Caregiver Toolkit. We will be talking about how the heat can affect people living with dementia and some of the ways that we can help to improve summer safety. My name is Blake Davis. I serve as the Education Program Manager for Alzheimer's Community Care. So today, some of the things that we are going to look at are going to be how heat exposure is an increasingly important health concern for our older adults, particularly those living with dementia. And so as we have these heat rises in the summertime and our increase in our heat waves, what are some of the things that families, caregivers, and our healthcare professionals need to know to help support that vulnerable population? And so some of these are going to be really specific to how dementia is affecting the brain, as it can impair judgment. It's going to make those changes in behavior, sometimes escalate during heat conditions. And the dementia itself can affect that person's ability to respond to physical stress, to communicate their needs. And so we know that heat is going to place an additional strain on the body and brain for adults without diseases like Alzheimer's, but for those with a neurocognitive disorder with dementia, those are going to have compounding vulnerabilities. So for individuals with dementia, even a moderate increase in temperature can trigger serious health consequences like dehydration, confusion, agitation, sometimes leading towards more hospitalizations and even in severe cases, death. So with older adults already having a reduced ability to regulate their body temperature due to age-related physiological changes, you have dementia added onto that, the risk multiplies. Because people with dementia may forget to drink water, to wear appropriate clothing for the weather, right? They might dress too heavy for the temperature during the day. And they may fail to seek shade or go into a cooler environment when their body is getting overheated. They can also misinterpret physical signals such as thirst or overheating. They might not be able to communicate to their caregiver what are they going through and how are they being affected. And so we're going to really talk about how is heat affecting biologically, cognitively, a person with dementia, and explaining why they're at a higher risk. And then what should caregivers look for? And what are some strategies that we can use to prevent these types of outcomes? And once we can understand these connections, we can do a lot to take proactive change. So why are people with dementia more vulnerable to heat? It's really because of that dementia symptom. It's going to affect multiple brain functions that are critical for self-protection. So the most important factor is that impaired awareness. Dementia can damage the brain regions responsible for recognizing internal body signals like thirst, hunger, and overheating. And so they may not feel thirsty even when they're dehydrated. They may not recognize that they're becoming dangerously hot, and they won't have the ability to problem solve to provide that solution. So that cognitive impairment is going to interfere with judgment and decision making. A person with dementia may not understand weather warnings. If they get that notification on their phone about the heat and about their temperature, they see that information, they don't do anything with it. They may dress in heavy clothing during that heat. They can remain outdoors for long periods of time without realizing that risk. And so that short-term memory loss, compounding that problem as they can forget to drink fluids, they forget caregivers' instructions, and then they don't follow them. Or they might forget how to access those cooling resources. If they're outside and they're getting hot, even forgetting to just be able to get up and come into the home to cool off. We are also looking at some communication difficulties is another major issue. So struggling to express discomfort or pain or confusion, which can make it hard for caregivers to detect early signs of heat-related illness. If their loved one's not able to communicate, oh, I'm really hot, or I need to cool off, or I'm uncomfortable. Instead, those caregivers have to rely on their observations. In addition, dementia and the irreversible disorders that cause it are often coexisting with other chronic medical conditions like heart disease, diabetes, kidney disease, All of these increase sensitivity to heat. And medications that are commonly prescribed for dementia and for the related behaviors can interfere with sweating, hydration, or temperature regulation. And so together, these factors will create a situation where somebody with dementia may be less able to adapt to the heat, less able to signal stress, and then more likely to experience those severe outcomes during hot weather. And so heat places a significant stress on the human body, particularly for older adults whose physiological symptoms are less resilient. So as temperatures rise, the body relies on sweating and an increase of blood flow to the skin to cool itself. In older adults, these mechanisms are often less affected. Aging reduces sweat production, slows circulation, and weakens the cardiovascular system, making it harder to dissipate heat. And again, I'm just talking about aging. I'm not talking about a neurocognitive disorder, right? But just the body as we're getting older. Dehydration is one of the earliest and the most common consequences to heat exposure. So when fluid intake is not keeping pace with fluid loss from sweating, our blood volume decreases. This can lead to low blood pressure, which can lead to dizziness. And then we're also reducing blood flow to vital organs, and that includes the brain. Heat exhaustion can occur when the body becomes overwhelmed, causing symptoms like weakness, nausea, headaches, and confusion. So if not addressed, these can then progress to that heat stroke, a life-threatening emergency that's going to require medical intervention. And of course, with our loved ones who are living with a neurocognitive disorder who are impacted by dementia, we always worry about that hospitalization because as you know, if you have been on this caregiver toolkit with Karen before, hospitals receive zero training in how to care for people with Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. At Alzheimer's Community Care, we operate specialized Alzheimer adult day centers. The Florida statute requires that we have extensive hours of training on that, whereas for hospitals, they have no mandated training. So many hospitals then their workers are not trained in this. Electrolyte imbalances are going to be another concern, as that excessive sweating will disrupt the sodium and potassium levels, which increases the risk of an irregular heartbeat and other neurological symptoms. For older adults with dementia, these physical effects are dangerous because that cognitive impairment is going to delay recognition and therefore treatment. So what can begin as a mild dehydration can then rapidly escalate into a medical emergency without timely intervention. Heat doesn't always only affect physical health. It's going to significantly worsen some cognitive and behavioral symptoms of dementia. So elevated temperatures and dehydration, reducing that blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain, impairing that cognitive function even further. People with dementia can experience sudden increases in confusion, disorientation, and memory problems during hot weather. Their behavioral symptoms like agitation, aggression, anxiety, restlessness can intensify. And that's going to not just create distress for that individual, but also their caregiver. Another serious concern is going to be wandering. So individuals with dementia might be uncomfortable, whether it's because of the heat in the home or they're dehydrated, experiencing symptoms. And so they may attempt to leave that home, or if they're in a facility due to that discomfort, or they're increasingly confused. And with those high temperatures, we're greatly increasing the risk of a heat-related injury or death during these episodes. And of course, when it comes to wandering events, we worry just about everything, right? That heat exposure outdoors, we worry about, the bodies of water that might be nearby that person might go into. It's very common that people with dementia, when they do wander, are drawn to bodies of water. So we have that risk of a drowning as well. And then we also, have a risk of things like traffic. And down here in South Florida, we have that high-speed rail. We even have, dangerous wildlife that can play into some of the other risks when somebody wanders from their environment. Sleep disturbances are also very common during a heat wave. And with that poor sleep, we're going to see a further decline in cognition, changes in mood, and daytime functioning as well. And all of these are greatly impacting that caregiver. So some of the early recognitions for these heat-related illnesses, of course, is going to be really helping to prevent those serious outcomes for people with dementia. Unfortunately, those warning signs are subtle. They're easy to mistake for progressions of dementia, and we don't want to do that. We want to really take into account what somebody's baseline is, and when we see anything that is outside of that baseline, to really identify it and to take action on that. Caregivers should look for, dry mouth, cracked lips, dark or strong smelling urine, or even reduced urination. If you can kind of identify someone as maybe a little dizzy, or if they are complaining about a headache or muscle cramps, all of these are signs to look out for. Some behavioral and cognitive changes can be the earliest indicators as well. So an increase in confusion, agitation, they're more irritable, they're more lethargic than they normally are, or they're just withdrawn, even if they're holding themselves in a posture that they don't normally hold themselves in, right? Anything that's deviating from that baseline, a noticeable decline in their attention span, in their speech, in their mobility, should raise that concern. In more severe cases, you'll see symptoms like nausea, vomiting, rapid heartbeat, fainting, or unusually warm or flushed skin. And because, again, for these individuals with dementia, they may not report, they may not vocalize that they're feeling unwell. And so caregivers are unfortunately having to rely on that observation over the verbal complaints. Any rapid change from that baseline, again, we want to take it seriously. We want to get it addressed promptly. Anything that we can do, early intervention is going to look like cooling. It's going to look like hydration. And if needed, that medical evaluation to prevent the progression from heat exhaustion and to heat stroke. So heat exposure is associated with a range of serious health outcomes for people living with dementia. Studies are showing they have higher rates of emergency department visits during this time, hospital admissions, and mortality, specifically among older adults with cognitive impairment during heat waves. Dehydration increases the risk of urinary tract infection, kidney injury, and electrolyte imbalances, all of which will worsen cognitive symptoms and can even trigger the onset of delirium. And so heat-related weakness and dizziness increases the likelihood of falls, right? So we're, of course, worried when we have an increase in falls that you're also going to have that risk for fractures, for head injuries. And then always, and again, this is multifaceted, we worry about that further reduction of independence for that person, with a neurocognitive disorder, because not only is it affecting them, right, and reducing their independence, but any reduction in independence for that individual is resulting in the caregiver having to come in and support more, right, and increasing their burden and their caregiving load for that individual. So for caregivers, those heat-related complications can add significant emotional, physical, and even financial burden, and they can even require urgent medical decisions and increased levels of supervision during the summer months. So some of our prevention strategies can be pretty straightforward, right? But some of the things that we actually want to look at are going to be proactive planning and daily routines that schedule. So hydration is number one, the most important protective measure. Caregivers should try to offer the fluids regularly throughout the day on a schedule instead of trying to just wait and see for signs of thirst. And this is also a really great technique for all of us to stay hydrated, especially here in Florida. We deal with heat year round. And if you're an older person, you might not be identifying when you're dehydrated. And when you do sense that signal, that thirst signal, your body's already dehydrated. So it's really important to try to keep up that hydration throughout the day. Water, diluted juices, like frozen yogurt, ice cream, and you can do sugar-free options if sugar is a problem. Fruits like watermelons, cucumbers, like just high water content foods can really help to promote that adequate hydration. Anything that's going to quickly turn into a liquid is treated as a liquid in the body. So even Jello is something that can help with hydration. Soups too is another great way to stay hydrated, but again, we're talking about heat, so you might not want hot soup during the summer months, but that is still a technique that you can use throughout the year. Maintaining a cool environment is equally critical. So air conditioning is obviously our most effective method, but it could become unavailable. It might not be enough, right? Especially when we have a heat wave. So fans, taking cold showers, if you're outdoors, those shaded areas, and also kind of identifying your cooling centers to reduce that heat exposure. Some of the ways that we can help keep the home cool is going to be to keep the blinds closed, limit the use of the oven, and if you're in a multi-story home, staying on that lower floor as heat rises. All of that's going to help promote, being cool and staying cool in the home. Caregivers should try to identify public locations that they can bring their loved one to in case of a power outage in the home, maybe a local library, a nearby coffee shop, and local government might have already identified cooling centers throughout your area that you can go to cool off during that heat. Clothing should be lightweight, loose fitting to promote heat loss from the body. And this can be quite a challenge, right? When correcting a loved one's clothing, many caregivers will say, like, this is a point of contention, right? Because, a lot of times their loved one wants to wear the same thing every day. They want to make that choice. And if they're making maybe the inappropriate choice for the weather, and having to correct that can really lead to, quite the argument. But we always want to try and start with that positive to help try to increase that cooperation. Oh, I love that sweater. Can we save it for another day and wear this instead? Right? There's no guarantees it'll work, but we can try. They go to grab that cardigan. Oh, I love that cardigan. Why don't we bring it with us instead of putting it on for now? And if you're cold and need it, you can put it on, right? Trying to always go and lead with that positive so we don't always feel like we're confronting them with a negative, and trying to really increase the possibility that they'll follow our instructions. No guarantees it'll work, but we can try. Activities should be scheduled during cooler parts of the day. So we're trying to get a walk in early morning or in the evening. If, we do anything, even for like all of us, when we're looking at doing strenuous tasks, if we have to do work out into the yard, try to avoid doing that during those peak heat hours. Caregivers should review their medications, their loved ones' medications with the healthcare provider to identify drugs that increase heat sensitivity and that also act as a diuretic. And so while you're with that provider, it might be a good idea to ask for recommendations for those electrolyte replenishing supplements, right? Those powders. A lot of them have a high sodium content, so there might be a brand that the provider prefers, one over the other, and just to kind of identify that, because we want to be mindful of sodium intake when it comes to those things as well. Establishing those routines and those visual cues, we can label water bottles, we can set reminders. All of these can help support that individual with dementia and staying cool and hydrated. Prevention is requiring consistency, vigilance, and adaptation to that individual's cognitive abilities. Caregivers play such a central role in protecting people with dementia during hot weather. A structured checklist can help ensure that those critical steps are not overlooked. So daily monitoring of fluid intake is essential, including keeping track of how much that person drinks, watching for signs of dehydration, and this is something that the caregiver can also be doing for themselves as well. Caregivers should check indoor temperatures regularly, ensure the cooling throughout the day and night. And so that way, if there is a problem with the air conditioner, you could try to get it resolved as soon as possible. And if you need to seek that relief at a cooling center, you can do so. As observing for those changes in the behavior or the cognition is especially important during heat waves, as they can be early signs of illnesses. And again, this is true all year round, or even things that are not heat related. any type of change in that behavior, in that cognition. If somebody is not doing their favorite activity, if they're not finishing their meals, if they have differed from their baseline, we know that something is causing that change. And we want to look at, what it is. And could it be a respiratory infection? Could it be, early signs of pneumonia? Could it be a UTI? And trying to get that addressed as quickly as possible. Medication schedules and side effects should be reviewed. So we know that those medications are not going to have some type of adverse reaction and further that person's ability to really tolerate the heat. And caregivers should prepare an emergency plan that includes things like contact information for healthcare providers, those nearby cooling centers, and emergency services. Emergency plans are not just going to include, things like a hurricane, but what to do during a regular storm, what to do if there's an extended power outage. And then speaking of hurricanes, you can check to see if you're in a mandatory evacuation zone by either calling your local government office or visiting the county's websites. You can just type your address into a map and they will identify if you are in one of those zones. Regular check-ins, either in person or by phone, are crucial for our individuals that live alone with symptoms of dementia. And we can help to use a consistent checklist approach to reduce that stress for caregivers and to also have a quicker response to problems as they come up, just ultimately really improving those safety outcomes for people with dementia. So some of our key takeaways and our final thoughts, he again has a profound and sometimes underestimated impact for people living with dementia. Cognitive impairment is going to reduce that ability to recognize that danger, to communicate the discomfort, and for that individual to take proactive approaches, which is going to make that heat exposure especially hazardous. Raising temperatures can worsen their symptoms, can worsen their behaviors, and will potentially increase the amount of medical emergencies that somebody can have during the summer months. And then, of course, it's placing that heavy burden on caregivers to really navigate that person in the heat and also navigate the healthcare system if they need to, go to the hospital, go to see their provider because they're experiencing heat-related illness. The good news is that many of these risks are preventable. Simple measures like regular hydration, cooling environment, that careful observation, and that advanced planning can really help to improve those outcomes. Caregivers, our healthcare providers, the community, we all have an essential role to protect and support our vulnerable individuals during these hot weather months. And so that is all I have for today. It's a lot of information. So thanks everyone. Have a great day.